Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. In this video, we'll talk about some famous courtesan writers from the Tang Dynasty. But before that, let's quickly look at the case of Consort Yang Guifei, since she's one of the most famous female figures in Chinese history, as one of the four great beauties, and represents the transition of women's position from Wu Zetian's era to the post-Wu Zetian era. Consort Yang was the consort of Emperor Xuanzong, Li Longji, the very emperor who had eradicated the female political power fostered by the era of Wu Zetian. When he was a young man, he had killed Empress Wei and Princess Anle in a coup, executed Shangguan Wan, and later forced his aunt, Wu Zetian's second daughter, Princess Taiping, to commit suicide. Princess Taiping's death in 713, the second year when Xuanzong became the emperor, marked the end of an era during which Tang palace women made ambitious bid for imperial power. Emperor Xuanzong had a long reign of over 40 years. This period falls under two reign titles of his, the Kaiyuan period and the Tianbao period. The Kaiyuan period has been regarded as an apex of the Chinese civilization. The Tianbao period, however, witnessed towards its end the devastating Lushan rebellion, Anshi Zhiluan, which lasted 8 years. After the Anshi Zhiluan, the Tang dynasty began a general decline. Similar to earlier cases in Chinese history, Consort Yang was blamed as the femme fatale behind the Lushan rebellion. At first, she was the consort of one of Xuanzong's sons, yet Xuanzong was smitten by her beauty and took her as his own concubine. Supposedly, after entering the palace around the year 745, she began to receive the emperor's exclusive favors. Consort Yang was a skilled dancer and famed for her extravagant dance known as coats of feathers, rainbow skirts, Ni Shang Yu Yi Wu. Enjoying a life of pleasure with the consort, Emperor Xuanzong spent a lot of time in his pleasure palace Huaqing, which had hot springs, away from his political duties. The emperor also appointed the consort's relatives to important positions, such as a cousin of hers, Yang Guozhong. The Yang clan's overbearing behaviors were widely resented by the courtiers. Lushan, the rebel leader who led to the downfall of the Tang dynasty, was a military leader and of a non-Han ethnicity. He acted as a clown at the imperial court to entertain the emperor and the consort, and some historical sources report that he called Consort Yang his foster mother in an attempt at pleasing the consort and developing a close tie with her. Due to the Yang clan's unpopularity at the court and Lushan's perceived close ties with the consort, she became the target for blame when the Lushan rebellion broke out in 755, 10 years after she entered the palace. When the rebel force approached the capital, the emperor was forced to run away with the consort. Yet his soldiers started a coup in which they killed Yang Guozhong, and then they told the emperor that the consort herself must die too. In order to preserve himself, the emperor ordered that she be strangled to death, and she was buried at the site known as Ma Wei Po. Although Consort Yang was blamed for the outbreak of the Lushan rebellion in some historical records, her image and her romance with Xuanzong became increasingly romanticized in later poetry and literature. The most famous literary piece of this kind is Bai Juyi's Song of Everlasting Pain, 长恨歌, written more than 50 years after the Lushan rebellion. In this long narrative poem, Bai Juyi portrays Consort Yang as a tragic figure and elaborates on the emperor's sorrows after her passing. As the last two lines of the poem say, "Heaven lasts, the earth endures, yet a time will come when they're gone. Yet this pain of ours will continue and never finally end. 天长地久有时尽，此恨绵绵无绝期." The emperor and the consort's shattered romance is here lamented as an eternal tragedy. Either as the femme fatale or as the tragic heroine, Consort Yang embodies the return of a much more subordinate female image after the reign of Empress Wu. In this painting about her mounting a horse from the Yuan dynasty, we can see this frail image of hers in the imagination of later generations. In the painting, the consort was too weak to mount the horse by herself, yet her delicate disposition is precisely what attracted the gaze of the emperor. Song of Everlasting Pain and Consort Yang's more sympathetic image in late Tang literature and poetry represent what can be called a culture of romance in Tang society. That is, there emerged a cultural interest in the aesthetic expression and endorsement of romantic passion. However, this culture of romance primarily stemmed from perspectives of men as exemplified by Song of Everlasting Pain. Another major expression of the culture of romance during the Tang time is the romantic relationship between poets and courtesans. Courtesans, a social group of women we introduced earlier, were similar to the geisha of Japan in that they possessed considerable literary and artistic skills. With the spread of the civil examination system in Tang Dynasty, a development indebted to the woman emperor Wu Zetian, scholars traveled more frequently for exams and for official appointments. These trips created an opportunity for them to socialize with and maybe have a relationship with courtesans of various areas. These relationships rarely lasted long, but with that fragile nature, they became a popular topic for love poetry. Here is a well-known poem from the late Tang Dynasty on the topic of bidding farewell to a courtesan by Du Mu. Great love may seem like none at all. Wine before us, we only know that smiles won't come. The tallow candle has a heart. It grieves at parting. In our place drips tears until the break of day. 多情却似总无情，唯觉樽前笑不成。蜡烛有心还惜别，替人垂泪到天明。 Then what about the courtesans themselves? They were by status prostitutes and were being held in a very low social regard. Whereas there were certainly brothels, and young women could be sold into these places, the courtesan writers we are aware of seem to act independently. They also seem to have come from gentry families that later declined and received education when they were young. Historical records on them are often vague and sometimes present conflicting information. One interesting pattern is that, whether historically true or not, it's often been reported that they lived or dressed as Daoist nuns. If these reports were true, a Daoist nunnery might provide these women with a place of their own to entertain the guests, a more socially acceptable image, as well as some mystique that might make them more attractive to their male patrons. Red Brush includes the writings of 3 Tang courtesans, Li Ye, Xue Tao, and Xuanji. Li Ye's story is quite tragic, and you can read it on your own. Here, we'll focus on the cases of Xue Tao and Xuanji. First, Xue Tao, one of the most famous courtesan writers in Chinese history. She lived in the city of Chengdu of the Sichuan province in southwest China, the province famous for its spicy food, as reported in Red Brush. Xue Tao spent all her life in the city of Chengdu, where for many years she was the leading lady at the parties thrown by the successive governors of Sichuan. The earliest sources simply describe her as a registered courtesan, but according to later stories, she was a native of Chang'an. Her father, who had been sent to Sichuan to take up a minor post, passed away while in Chengdu and left her mother a widow. Eventually, his daughter drifted into the life of a courtesan. By this account, it's clear that Xue Tao was from the family of a scholar official, but later became a courtesan, likely owing to the decline of her family fortunes after the death of her father. The poems now attributed to Xue Tao are usually written in the voice of a lovesick woman or of a courtesan. For instance, in this poem on the Willow Floss, she compares the fate of a courtesan to that of the tantalizing yet fickle floss in the spring months. 2月杨花轻复微，春风摇荡惹人衣。他家本是无情物，一向南飞又北飞。The second month, the willow floss, so light and ethereal, tossed about by the spring breeze, tugs at your gown. But actually, it is an object bereft of feeling. Now it drifts to the south, then to the north. Whereas the image of the willow floss in this poem is certainly metaphoric of romantic relations, it's unclear if Xue Tao compares herself or her male patron to the willow floss that's bereft of feelings. Yet, in general, the easy mingling and parting of willow floss provide a vivid metaphor for the life of a courtesan, for whom passion and relationships are always short-lived. However, despite her low social status as a courtesan, Xue Tao's literary and artistic gifts were truly extraordinary and won the respect of both her male patrons and the later generations. In one source, we read that a male patron of hers, the governor of the Sichuan province, recommended her for a minor official post as a collator in the imperial library, a post that was usually given as the first appointment for a scholar who passed the civil examinations. However, after making such a recommendation, the governor was told by his supervisor that it was unthinkable. First, Xue Tao was a woman. Second, she was a public woman, a courtesan. Even though the governor's request was not granted, the fact that he took such an unconventional step to make this unthinkable recommendation indicates how much respect he had for Xue Tao's talents. Another indication of Xue Tao's brilliance was that she's a gifted calligrapher. Her calligraphy works were so extraordinary that they were collected by later connoisseurs. Emperor Huizong of the Song dynasty, in the 12th century, was an accomplished artist himself and an ardent collector of art. A catalogue compiled at his court contains the following assessment of Xue Tao's calligraphy. The marvelousness of her running script to a large degree captures the method of Wang Xizhi. It's certainly not a minor compliment for a courtesan's calligraphy to be compared to that of the great Wang Xizhi, the Eastern Jin courtier and nobleman known as the calligraphy sage. Unfortunately, none of Xue Tao's calligraphy has been passed on to today, so we can only imagine her art based on these past records. Today, cultural memory about Xue Tao continues through sites such as her Memorial Museum in Chengdu, which you can visit if you travel to the city. In addition to being a brilliant calligrapher and poet, Xue Tao was also an entrepreneur of sort, and made a special brand of letter paper known as Xue Tao's letter paper, as described in Red Brush. Tao lived on the banks of the 100 Flowers Pond, and with her own hand made small letter paper of a deep red color, which she cut to size for writing the poems she presented to these eminent personalities. People call this Xue Tao's letter paper. Possibly, Xue Tao supported herself financially by trading her letter paper. She lived by herself and was never married. She passed away in her 70s, having enjoyed a lifespan that's quite long by the standards of the time, especially in comparison to other courtesans. In some sources, it's said that she often dressed like a Daoist nun. One male poet Xue Tao might have had a deeper relationship with was Yuan Zhen, who was famous for penning the best-known love story in the Chinese tradition, The Tale of Ying Ying. The Tale of Ying Ying is likely semi-autobiographical, focusing on the love affair between student Zhang and a young girl named Ying Ying when they happened to sojourn in the same temple. The Tale of Ying Ying, however, was likely based on Yuan Zhen's love affair with a young woman from a gentry or aristocratic family, and had nothing to do with Xue Tao. It later inspired the famous play from the Yuan dynasty period, Romance of the Western Chamber, Xuanji. As to Xue Tao's relationship with Yuan Zhen, we may find the following anecdote from the Tang period. As soon as Minister Yuan heard that among the registered courtesans of Sichuan, there was a certain Xue Tao, who was competent in poetry and extremely eloquent, he continuously longed for her in his heart. When he was appointed an investigating commissioner, he asked to be posted to Sichuan. But as he was judging cases in his capacity as censor, it was impossible for him to go to visit her. When he was later relieved of his duties and transferred to the position of commissioner, the prefect Yan Shuo, knowing of Yuan Zhen's desires, again and again sent Xue Tao over to him. When Yuan Zhen was about to depart, he did not dare take her with him. Once he had been appointed to the Hanlin Academy, he sent her the following poem. The rippling waves of Brocade River and the glory of Mount Emei have, through the art of transformation, produced Wenjun and Xue Tao. In speech so skillful, they steal the parrot's tongue. In style so brilliant, they earn the phoenix plumes. In droves the poets all lay down their writing brushes, while each and every high official dreams of appointment there. Since our separation, my longing has been blocked by misty rivers. The calamus flowers must be blooming. The clouds of dusk are high. 锦江华腻峨眉秀，唤出文君与薛涛。言语巧偷鹦鹉舌，文章分得凤凰毛。纷纷此刻多停笔，个个公卿玉梦刀。别后相思隔烟水，菖蒲花发五云高。As indicated by this account, Yuan Zhen took the initiative to approach and pursue Xue Tao after he learned about her reputation. Yet after to actually develop a relationship, he had to leave her behind to pursue his own career. As to the poem, whereas it complements Xue Tao's literary talent, it's also very clear about who she is to his mind, a public woman socializing with many men, and in the fantasies of many men. The ending lines express his longings, yet no desire or prospect at getting back together with her again. Then what's Xue Tao's side of the story? Traditionally, there's a set of 10 quatrains known as 10 separations, a tribute to Xue Tao. One theory is that she wrote these poems after being separated from Yuan Zhen. However, there are other accounts about her writing these poems for another male patron. Furthermore, as reported in Red Brush, it may also be possible that the author of these poems was a male secretary of Yuan Zhen's with the same surname Xue. He wrote these poems to apologize with the hope to get his job back after he wounded his boss with chopsticks after he was drunk and lost his post for that. So there are many possible backdrops to these well-known poems. Let's read two examples from the set, and you may come up with your own interpretation as to whether their author was Xue Tao. The first of the set is called Dog Separated from Its Master. 犬离主，初入朱门4、5年，未知仁义得人怜。近园咬着亲之客，不得红丝毯上眠。The most docile in this wealthy household for several years, fragrant fur and clean paws, beloved by its master, but ever since it, without warning, bit a cherished guest, no longer is it allowed to sleep on the red silk carpet. And here's the second poem. 比离手，月管喧号使之情，红铅纸上撒花琼。都缘用酒风头尽，不得惜之手里琴。The writing brush, separated from the hand. Only when made of bamboo from Yue and hairs from Xuan can it scatter the most exquisite flowers on red letter paper. But because through long use it has lost its sharp point, no longer does Wang Xizhi want to hold it in his hand. By these two examples, you should get the gist of the set. They all compare the poet to an object at the disposal of its master, the other party, a lover, or a superior, or both. So could Xue Tao have written these subservient poems? For comparison's sake, let's look at a poem that's more verifiably hers. For unknown reasons, Xue Tao once offended one of her most ardent supporters, Wei Gao, who once served as the governor of Sichuan. And as a result, she was banished to a region close to Tibet. There, she wrote a poem seeking forgiveness. I had heard about the sufferings of the border, but only after coming here do I know them. Full of shame, I now sing my festive songs for our boys who serve over here in Long. 闻说边城苦，而今道是知。休将门下曲，唱于陇头儿。There are also theories that the 10 separation poems were written under the same circumstances to Wei Gao. What happened was that Xue Tao managed to return to Chengdu and spend the rest of her life there. Wei Gao might also be the governor who recommended Xue Tao for an official post, although we're not sure if that was before or after her banishment. Xue Tao's case may illustrate the very unequal gender relations characterizing Courtesan's romance with her male patron. Yet, living up to the 70s, very much on her own means, Xue Tao had a relatively happy ending in comparison to other courtesans of the Tang period. For that, let's move to the case of Xuanji. Let's begin with this introduction from Red Brush. We know very little about Xuanji's early years other than that she was born around the year 848 to a family of modest means. We also know that she spent most of her short life in the capital of Chang'an. At the age of 15, she became the concubine of the censor Li Yi and accompanied him on a journey to central China. Later, perhaps her husband was tired of her, or he was forced by his principal wife. Xuanji was sent away from the family, and she took on the life of a Daoist nun, as shown in this illustration. We do have a few poems from Xuanji painting herself in the image of a Daoist nun, such as in this poem, in which she refers to visiting another nun, yet missing her. To visit refining Master Zhao, but not finding her at home. 访照炼师不遇. Where has she gone with her fellow immortals, leaving her servant girl alone at home? On her warm stove, medicines are still simmering, and in an adjoining courtyard, tea is being brewed. The painted walls remain dark despite the lamp's glow. The poles hung with pennants throw slanting shadows. I leave my regards, and just as I turn around, a few blossoming branches beyond the wall. 何处同仙侣，青衣独在家。暖炉留煮药，林苑未煎茶。画壁灯光暗，翻干日影斜。殷勤重回首，墙外树枝花。Unable to find a Daoist friend was a common poetic motif of the Tang period, as it portrays the elusiveness of the Daoist hermit. Here is a famous poem featuring the motif by Jia Dao. Looking for a hermit but not finding them, 寻隐者不遇. Under the pines I questioned the boy. My master's off gathering herbs. All I know is that he's here on the mountain. Clouds are so deep, I don't know where. 松下问童子，言师采药去。只在此山中，云深不知处。Yu Xuanji's poem offers a female version of the motif, situating Daoist nuns on par with male Daoists. While living the life of a Daoist nun, Yu Xuanji also became a courtesan. Perhaps she was bored, or perhaps she needed to make a living. In a detailed story about her from the 10th century, almost 200 years after her lifetime, we find the following depiction of her life as a non-courtesan. However, possessed as she was of the weak nature of a fragrant orchid, she was incapable of preserving her honor. She allowed herself to accept the advances of powerful bosses and accompanied them on their excursions and elsewhere. All the men about town vied with each other to appear at their finest in the hopes of starting an affair with her. Occasionally, they would come to visit her, bring wine with them, and she would strum the zither and recite poetry, interspersing this with risque banter. Those with insufficient learning would feel very much out of place. Although the passage acknowledges that she's being taken advantage of by men, it also blames her for having a frail nature and being unable to discipline herself. Clearly, the story is again written from a male-centered perspective. From this perspective, Yu Xuanji's life is pitiful, blameful, but also a subject of curiosity. Yu Xuanji's love poems can be exemplified by this example addressed to a famous poet of the time, Wen Tingyun. By the stones of the stairs, the crowded crickets chirp. On the trees in the courtyard, the misty dew is clear. Under the light of the moon, music from nearby is heard. As seen from my room, the distant mountains are bright. A chilly breeze settles on the pearly mat. The encrusted regret rises from the jade zither. If you, my Jikang, are too lazy to drop me a note, what else is there that will assuage my autumn feelings? 街气乱琼鸣，亭柯烟露清。月中林月响，楼上远山明。真照凉风灼，瑶琴寄恨生。积君懒书札，底物为秋情。This poem is full of images coming from the literati tradition, such as zither playing. It's also filled with evocative images of autumn, the season of sorrow and separation in Chinese poetry. Towards the end, the poem compares her poet-lover to Ji Kang, the leading figure of the Seven Sages, famed for his zither music. Clearly a very elegant compliment for her lover, while gently reminding him to drop her a note. Despite her elegant poems infused with literati tropes and Daoist influences, Xuanji ended her life in an apparently tragic and violent manner. Again, to quote from her detailed biography from the 10th century. Her servant girl, Lu Qiao, was also very clever and beautiful. One day, when Yu Xuanji had been invited by the nuns of the adjoining courtyard in the convent, she left Lu Qiao with the following instructions. Don't go out, and if a guest should show up, just tell him that I'm at such and such a place. Xuanji was kept longer than expected by her girlfriends and did not return to her own courtyard until evening. Lu Qiao opened the gate for her, saying, Just a moment ago, such and such a guest showed up. When he heard that you were not in, he went away without dismounting from his horse. Now, although this guest was an old patron of hers, Xuanji suspected Lu Qiao of having an affair with him. That night, she lit a lamp and after locking the door, ordered Lu Qiao to come into her bedroom so as to question her. Lu Qiao said, During all the years that I have been your servant, I have truly behaved myself properly and have never committed a transgression of the sort that would offend you. Moreover, when that guest arrived, I kept the door locked, and it was from behind the door that I informed him that you were not at home. He then went away without saying a word, spurring on his horse. You talk about love, but it has been years since I have harbored that kind of feeling in my heart. Mistress, please do not doubt me. But Xuanji only grew more enraged. Stripping her servant naked, she lashed her hundreds of times with a cane. But Lu Qiao continued to protest her innocence. She then collapsed to the ground, and requesting a cup of water, she poured it out on the ground, saying, You wish to pursue the way of longevity of the three purities, but are incapable of denying yourself the pleasures of removing your skirts and sharing the couch. But because of your inveterate suspicion, you falsely accuse me, who am chaste and correct. It turns out I will be dying a cruel death under your brutal hands. If there is no heaven, I will have nowhere to lodge my complaint. But if there is, no one will be able to thwart my stubborn soul. I swear I will not wriggle about like a worm in deepest darkest, and allow you to indulge in your lasciviousness. As soon as she had spoken those words, she passed away right there on the spot. Xuanji was filled with fear and buried her in a hole that she dug in her backyard, thinking that no one would find out. This took place in the first month of spring in the 9th year of full communication. Whenever someone would ask after Lu Qiao, Xuanji would say, She ran away after the spring rains cleared. Once a guest who had been dining in Xuanji's room went out into her backyard to urinate. On the spot where Xuanji had buried Lu Qiao, he noticed quite a number of green flies, which, when he chased them away, only came back again. When he looked more carefully, he noticed not only traces of what appeared to be blood, but a rancid smell as well. After the guest had left, in confidence, he told his servant what he had seen. The servant, once he got home, told it in turn to his elder brother. Now this elder brother was a patrolman. He had once asked Xuanji for money, but she had ignored him, and so he harbored a grudge against her. When he heard this story, he immediately went to the convent gate to spy on her. When he overheard people speculating as to why they hadn't seen Lu Qiao coming in and out, the patrolmen called together some additional police officers, and with spades in their hands, they rushed into Xuanji's courtyard. When they dug Lu Qiao up, they found that her face looked just as it had when she was alive. The policeman arrested Xuanji, and when she was questioned by the clerks of Chang'an Prefecture, she confessed. Many of the gentlemen at court tried to intervene on her behalf, but the prefecture submitted her name to the emperor in the memorial, and when autumn came around, she was, in fact, executed. While in prison, she also wrote poems, the most beautiful couplets of which are the following. Easy it is to find a priceless treasure, difficult it is to find a steadfast lover. 一求无价宝，难得有情郎. And a full moon shines through the dark crack, a clear breeze blows open my short jacket. 明月照幽细，清风开短襟. The couplet, easy it is to find a priceless treasure, difficult it is to find a steadfast lover. 一求无价宝，难得有情郎, is still widely known today. Yet, if the story were true, the circumstances of its writing are quite violent and tragic. However, was the story true? For an account written more than a century after the fact, it clearly sounds too detailed, and the maid's speech before her death is rather dramatic and sounds very righteous, almost resembling the voice of a scholar. Again, I guess we need to read the story with a grain of salt. However, very likely Yu Xuanji was sentenced to death on the charge of murder, regardless of what actually happened. Traditionally, there were also readers who had questioned the validity of the account on Yu Xuanji's murderous act. One account from the 14th century portrays Yu Xuanji as a devout Daoist nun and mentions nothing about the manner of her death. In the early 20th century, the Dutch diplomat and sinologist Robert Han van Gulik learned about Yu Xuanji's story and wrote about it in one of his popular Judge Dee novels. If you're interested, you may check it out. Finally, let's look at another poem by Yu Xuanji, written during her short life, a poem that compares herself to wilted peonies. Facing the wind, they evoke a sigh as their petals continues to fall. Their fragrance fades and dissolves as yet another spring goes by. It must be because of their high price that no one shows interest, and because of their extreme fragrance, butterflies cannot come near. Their red flowers are fit to be grown only inside the palace. How could their green leaves bear to be tainted by dew and dust? But when their roots will have been transplanted to the imperial park, you, my prince, will then regret that you can no longer buy them. 临风轻叹落花频，芳意浅消又一春。因为价高人不问，却缘相甚蝶难亲。红英只称深宫里，翠叶哪堪染露尘。及至一根上林苑，王孙方恨灵无音。Even though it's common for male poets to compare an abandoned woman to wilted flowers, Yu Xuanji's poem in fact argues that she's still valuable and desirable in her wilted state, and the reason why the flower hasn't been picked up was owing to its extraordinary and thus intimidating beauty and fragrance. Finally, she urges that poets interested in her must hurry up, or else she might have been selected for the inner palace. It could be wishful thinking on her part, or she's merely making an advertisement for herself. Or maybe the line is characterized by a bitter self-irony. in the words of the authors of Red Brush. This poem betrays a strong self-consciousness, which we'll see even more clearly in the following poem, in which she complains on not being able to participate in the civil exams since she's a woman. Cloudy peaks fill one's eyes under a clear spring sky. Clearly legible silver hooks emerge from their fingers. Oh, how I hate this gauze gown for hiding my verses. To no avail I look up with envy at the names on the list. 云风满目放春情，粒粒银钩指下生。自恨罗衣掩诗句，举头空羡榜中名。To understand this poem, we should know that it was quite common for poets to write poems on the walls of temples or other types of public sites. It's usually a male privilege for leaving one's personal and artistic marks in those public spaces. And it is even more so a male privilege to participate in the civil examinations. These examinations were extremely competitive, and the announcement of successful candidates was a grand ritual, with the names being announced on banners or billboards as shown here. Sometimes these signs were gilded for extra flair. Having your name listed on a gilded billboard, 金榜题名, is a common phrase to refer to a man's successful career as a scholar. So, what must have stimulated Xuanji's poem must be the sight of examination candidates bragging about their success by listing their names on the wall of the monastery. As a woman and a courtesan, she was excluded from that circle of success and can only live on the mercy of those male scholars. In that state of thought, she wrote this poem that was not even subtle about the gender restrictions being placed on her. In the words of the authors of Red Brush, this poem is probably the only one from this period in which a woman so nakedly voices her dissatisfaction at the limitations imposed upon her by her gender. Here we conclude this lecture. Please complete the quiz below the video. And since there are a lot of historical mysteries in this class materials, I created an anonymous poll for your intuitive responses. I look forward to your discussion and feedbacks.